So good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us on this webinar today, where we'll be presenting our proposal for the Hawthorn Pit Solar Farm. Sorry we're unable to meet up in person due to the current situation, but we hope this will still help you get a good view of our proposals and allow us to answer all of your questions. So I'm Chloe, I'm the Community Liaison Manager here at Aura Power, and I'm joined by my colleague Chris, our UK Development Manager, Rachel from Dillis, who are our planning consultants, and Sophie, who's our PR and comms consultant. So before we go into the proposal itself, I just want to explain to you how this webinar will work. We will take about 30 minutes presenting the plans and then open up the virtual floor for any questions you may have for us to answer. Your microphones will be muted for all of the session, but you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can type your question for us to answer out loud. We will only be answering questions once we have presented our plans, so please feel free to type your questions at any time during this session. However, I would advise waiting until the end in case your question is covered in our presentation. So this webinar is also being recorded and will be available to watch again on our website. If you are watching the recorded version and have a question that has not been addressed, please do contact me. We'll also make the presentation slides available to download. We would also like to ask you to complete our short feedback form after the webinar, which I'll send round following this session. So just to mention that we are aware that National Grid is currently consulting on plans for a converter station and substation nearby to our proposed site. However, it should be noted that these plans are completely separate from ours. So who is Aura Power? So we are a renewable energy developer based in Bristol and founded in 2013. We have around 20 staff here in total and a dedicated UK team. We have numerous utility scale solar farms and battery storage sites in development, not only in the UK, but also in the Republic of Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Canada, and the US. We are a partner of IB Vote, an engineering firm that's built over 1 gigawatt of solar farms worldwide and developed projects on a global scale. That equates to over 3 million solar panels with over 80 solar farms of varying sizes, of which more than half of those are situated in the UK. So with the experience and financial backing of a global company like IB Vote, we have the capability and financial security to see a project all the way through its development process to construction and then onto operation. As a responsible developer, our remit is to develop the solar farm design whilst engaging with the local community and subsequently obtain planning permission. IB Vote will then construct and operate the solar farm once it's built. Okay, so why solar? So as we all know, we are in a climate and ecological emergency, and it's important to recognise why solar can play such an important role in the future of the energy sector and our environment. A recent report by the International Energy Association laid out the roadmap to achieving net zero emissions globally by 2050. It stated that to meet this challenge, the world will need to install 4 times the amount of wind and solar energy that it did in 2020. This equates to adding a solar park every day over the next 9 years. In 2019, the UK government became the first in the world to set a legally binding target for net zero emissions by 2050. And the Climate Change Committee's most recent landmark report states a target of 85 gigawatts of solar generation by 2050. That equates to approximately a total of 1,700 solar farms, around the same size as this one in the UK alone. And that's 8.5 times more solar power than we were generating in 2019. We've already seen a substantial increase in wind and solar generation, with renewables outpacing fossil fuel generation for the first time last year. Renewables now account for about 40% of total electricity generation in the UK. With the electrification of heating and transport, as we move away from gas boilers and petrol-fueled cars, the demand for electricity is expected to rise threefold in the next decade. Solar energy is already proven to be the cheapest form of new electricity generation, according to the International Energy Agency, and the government's recent energy white paper demonstrates the important role it will play to complement wind in the country's future transition to net zero. Furthermore, as it's no longer supported by subsidies, this helps to reduce energy prices for everyone. This area has a proud history of helping to supply power to the nation, and this solar farm will help continue that legacy as part of the green energy revolution. Durham County Council has set a commendable target to become carbon neutral by 2050, and solar funds like this will help the council realise this goal. As well as generating clean, renewable energy, this solar farm will enrich local biodiversity, continue the use of agriculture via sheep grazing, and restore the soil to an even better condition after the farm has been decommissioned. The solar farm will have a capacity of up to 49.9 megawatts, which we estimate will generate enough electricity to power the equivalent of over 17,000 typical County Durham homes and save over 15,000 tonnes of CO2 from entering the atmosphere each year. The power generated from the solar farm could also power the equivalent of over 26,000 electric cars every year. Okay, so as you can see from the map here, our proposed site is located between Merton and South Hetton. Our application boundary covers approximately 64 hectares of land, with 87% of that used for biodiversity improvements. It lies in the parish of Merton, with South Hetton as a neighbouring parish. The land is owned by one landowner who is looking to diversify their land use, as farming in the UK is becoming increasingly challenging through more unpredictable weather and market conditions. Whilst the land is currently used for growing cereal crops, it is not best most versatile agricultural land. Furthermore, during the lifetime of the solar farm, the land can continue to be used for food production with sheep grazing, as we've already mentioned. As the fields will be left fallow, the soil will benefit from being restored and improve its natural long-term fertility. Finding a suitable site for a solar farm can be very difficult, as there are many constraints that need to be sensibly considered and balanced. Finding sufficient capacity on the electricity grid is one of the most difficult challenges, and we have been fortunate enough to secure a grid connection with Northern Power Grid, connecting directly into the substation at Hawthorn Pit. The land is also not subject to any land or environmental designations, and all of the footpaths will be retained. So, as well as the grid connection and suitability of the land, we believe this site is also suitable for a number of other reasons. Being proximate to the coast, there are good levels of sunlight in this part of the country. This, along with enough relatively flat land and a viable grid connection, allows the solar farm to generate enough clean electricity to be commercially viable. There is an excellent opportunity to enhance biodiversity on site, and from the A1 motorway, there is suitable access route to the site. We have also undertaken a number of environmental studies, which we'll speak about later, and include archaeology, flood risk, traffic, noise, and ecology, amongst others, to minimise impacts. Ecologically sensitive areas and archaeological areas identified in our studies have been avoided. There is also a history of industrial use, which provides good potential for energy generation. I'll now hand over to Chris, who will explain to you what makes up a solar farm.
Thank you, Chloe, and good evening, everybody. So what makes up a solar farm? There are a number of different components that make up the constituent parts of a solar farm. Firstly, there are the panels, as you can imagine. Panels are laid out in rows with enough space between and underneath them for sheep to graze. Solar technology is advancing rapidly, and we'll be using fixed tilt bifacial panels which allow higher efficiency in converting sunlight to solar energy. The panels will have a lower edge of 0.7 meters and a maximum height of 3 meters. Between each row, there will be 2.10 meters. This will enable the land to be grazed underneath the panels throughout the lifetime of the project. There'll also be fencing, which will be 2 meters high, and it will be deer fencing, and will secure the perimeter of the site. There will be enough space for small mammals to pass through the fencing. There'll also be access tracks, some of which will be new, although we will endeavour to use existing access tracks where possible. New access tracks would have the appearance of typical vernacular farm tracks with a crushed stone surface, 4 meters in width. The tracks would be allowed to grass over in time. Inverters will be located either under the panels or in the centre of most arrays and convert the power from DC to AC. There'll also be transformers, which are used to step up the voltage to then be distributed into the grid network. Storage units as well, which will contain spare parts. Furthermore, there'll also be infrared CCTV. This will be positioned on poles around the perimeter for additional security and safety measures. They look down the fence line and not into people's houses or gardens. There'll also be a substation. This is where we connect into the grid network that feeds into the larger substation just to the south of our site. The compound will contain a number of electrical infrastructure components, an office and a storage building surrounded by a security fence and tree planting. There'll also be a temporary construction compound, which will be temporary in nature and will service the construction of the solar farm. There'll also be a series of underground cables that connect the panels to the transformers and then onto the substation immediately to the south of the site. So in terms of the layout, the panel arrays cover around half of the total site, including the space between them, and will only disturb a very small proportion of the ground, at less than 1%, as it is only the posts which are pile driven into the ground for the panels to sit on top of. This allows plenty of space for sheep to graze safely beneath them. The grass can still grow under the panels on a UK solar farm, despite the misconception that shade prevents it from doing so. And indeed, the panels can afford the sheep some protection from bad weather and shade in sunny weather. The substation is located on the south of our site, as close to the existing substation as possible. This is where we connect the electricity into the grid to supply clean energy to your homes. Trees will be planted along the outer edge to screen the substation from footpath users. We will be using monocrystalline silicon-based solar panels, which have up to 96% recycling efficiency. The operational period of the solar farm would be 40 years. Once the end of the operational period is reached, the solar farm would be decommissioned and the land returned back to its former state, in likely better condition than it was before, as vastly reduced quantities of pesticides and fertilizers would have been used for farming. In addition to the solar panels and associated infrastructure, the proposal includes substantial ecological and landscape enhancement, such as new tree and hedgerow planting, hedgerow enrichment, improved grassland and wildflower areas. We are retaining all existing hedgerows in and around the site, infilling gaps for screening and improving the vegetation on the eastern boundary. Tree belts and hedges will be planted on the northern and southwestern perimeter to assist with screening and biodiversity corridors. The improved grassland beneath and around the panels allows us significant gains in biodiversity. Wildflowers will be sown to further boost biodiversity and attract much needed pollinators to help tackle the ecological crisis. All of the footpaths in and around the site will be retained. For safety reasons, they will need to be temporarily closed during construction, but the footpath on the eastern side will remain open to connect Merton to South Hetton. Some of the footpaths will be used for access during maintenance, but as maintenance requirements are seldom, this will be very infrequent. Our plans do not include planting new hedgerows along either side of all footpaths, as we want to avoid any tunneling effect for the safety of footpath users. Instead, we have focused on improving biodiversity and protecting views from the most sensitive residential receptors, as well as the more commonly used footpaths across the site. These areas could have much amenity value, as well as educational, by installing information boards to inform users of the solar farm, local wildlife, climate change, and so on. There is no security lighting when the solar farm will be operational. The only lighting that may be in place will be during construction. However, as construction will mainly take place during daylight hours and in the summer, lighting requirements will be minimal. It should be noted that as solar farms are very quiet, we do not predict any adverse effects on residential receptors nearby. Thank you, Chloe. These next few slides show what the site will look like from a number of viewpoints before and after the solar farm is built. We recognise that the solar farm will provide a change to the landscape, though we hope that with the proposed screening, we can mitigate and reduce the extent of these changes. We are also excited by the biodiversity and ecological improvements that development will provide for local wildlife. The views that you will see in due course are based on viewpoints that we have been agreed with the council to provide the widest representation for a range of receptors. We have prepared imagery for this consultation at numbers 1, 2, and 7, and the rest will be submitted with our planning application. Note that these are based on winter views, and so any existing hedgerows and trees will not be in leaf. This is to show a worst case scenario, as the summer months will have leaves on trees. So this viewpoint is taken from the western side of Merton, just over 270 meters away from the nearest proposed panel. It faces into the middle of our proposed site onto the footpath near Beaconside Farm. The top photo shows the current view, the middle shows the view just after the solar farm has been built, and the bottom shows the projected view after 10 years when the hedges have grown to around 3.5 to 4 meters high. This viewpoint is taken again from the same spot, but facing directly south towards the western edge of our proposed site. Again, you can see here the solar farm just after it has been built, and then 10 years later once the hedges have grown. You can see from the existing pylons that it is already an industrial outlook. Thank you, Chloe. Next slide, please. So this viewpoint is taken 238 meters northeast of our site at Merton on the footpath near Merton House Farm. The photograph has been taken in a southwesterly direction. Again, the top image shows the current view, the middle just after the solar farm has been built, and the bottom after 10 years once the planting has matured. Again, you can see how the landscape has an industrial setting with a long stretch of pylons in the background. Indeed, the open strip running down the middle is a buffer zone we have to leave for the existing power lines running across the site. Next slide, please, Chloe. Thank you. This viewpoint is taken nearly 2 kilometers away at Cold Heselden, just beyond Dalton Park. You can very faintly make out the arrays on the horizon line underneath the existing pylons. The construction of the solar farm will take place over a 4-month period. If consented this year, we wouldn't be looking to start the build until at least the spring of next year, but we would notify the local community well in advance. The route shown here is an indicative route coming off the A1 motorway via Hetton-le-Hole and South Hetton. We will work with the Highways Authority to keep local traffic disruption to a minimum. Where possible, we would also use existing field access tracks to reach areas of panels further within the solar farm site, and compacted gravel will be used where existing access tracks are not adequate for HGVs. A traffic management plan will be implemented prior to construction. Most construction traffic will arrive on site in the first few weeks of construction, after which the number of HGVs will reduce significantly. HGV movements will happen outside peak times, and a contact number will be made available for any residents who have any concerns over this period. As the solar farm requires little maintenance, after construction there will be minimal traffic going into the site. So there is an abundance of evidence showing that the maintenance practices of solar farms can significantly improve local biodiversity, thereby addressing the UK's biodiversity crisis by providing habitats and food for wildlife. This is not only due to there being less intervention on the land compared with when the land was farmed with pesticides and fertilizers, but also due to the measures developers like us are putting in place to promote biodiversity. As the panels sit on piles, there is minimal disturbance to the ground, which allows the grass to continue to grow and the potential for sheep to graze beneath them. Arable fields are converted to a species-rich pasture with wildflower meadows acting as a stable store of carbon, a dual benefit to combat climate change and boost biodiversity. As the fields are left fallow for the life of the solar farm, the soil will be kept healthy, boost carbon sequestration, and after the solar farm has reached the end of its life, it can be removed with up to 96% of equipment recycled. And the land will then be returned to its previous state or in an even better state than before. A solar farm is a bit like a wildlife reserve. The land is being taken out of intensive agricultural production and largely left to return to nature. It is worth stressing that we will build the panels and infrastructure around existing hedges and trees. Vegetation removal will be minimal and only if needed for access. The fence will allow for small mammals to cross the site. Up to 55 hectares of arable land will be converted to improved grassland, allowing substantial gains in biodiversity. Wildflower areas will be added around the site. We will also be planting 2.2 kilometers of new hedgerows and 1 kilometer of new trees and enhancing many of the existing hedgerows. This would allow for a significant gain in biodiversity and greatly benefit local wildlife, estimated to be an increase of over 70%. Indeed, a recent study by the Solar Trade Association discovered that some solar panels had up to 6 times more pollinators than adjacent fields without solar panels on. With this in mind, there is an opportunity here to install beehives, And if this is something you might be interested in, then please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Chris. So moving on to how we monitor these commitments. So we will be producing a landscape and ecological management plan. So this will ensure the biodiversity gains, which Chris mentioned, are maximised throughout the lifetime of the solar farm. The plan will be agreed with Durham County Council and will outline the management regime of the solar farm. So progression of the habitats will be monitored annually and reports will be submitted to the council. The LEMP is what it's known as, the Landscape and Ecological Management Plan, will be regularly reviewed and adapted if necessary to ensure the biodiversity aims are met. So I mentioned earlier that we have been undertaking a number of surveys and assessments, and those have been underway by our specialist consultants. Not all of the results are available yet, but I'll summarise the findings that we have so far. The reports will also be available to view with our application once it's submitted to the council. So ecology-wise, we've undertaken a number of ecology surveys over the past year, including breeding birds, wintering birds, great crested newts, bats, badgers, water voles, hares, and also a full ecological impact assessment. So where wildlife is identified, suitable measures will be implemented for protection recommended by our ecologists. So landscape, a comprehensive assessment is underway by a landscape architect and consultant with the council, and a full report including proposed mitigation will be submitted with the planning application. So heritage, our studies show that there will be no impact on any listed buildings, conservation areas and scheduled monuments. We've also undertaken a geophysical survey, which along with the historical records has identified some areas of potential archaeological interest within our site. On the advice of the council's heritage officer, we will undertake limited trial trenching to prove the results of the geophysical survey. The geophys survey shows how this has been quite an industrial area for many years, and our layout that we're proposing avoids these identified areas, which instead provides additional space for biodiversity enhancements. So a couple of points on amenity. So number one, noise. So a noise assessment has already been undertaken based on the design that we have presented to you today. It should be noted that solar farms are very quiet. It's really only the inverters and transformers that make any noise, which dissipates within about 100 meters. Any noise that is generated will be limited to the daytime when the solar farm is operation and when the sun is shining. These have been located as far away from residential dwellings as possible, so we don't envisage any impacts there. A glint and glare assessment is also underway. The site is in flood zone 1, meaning it is very low probability of flooding from rivers and the sea. A flood risk assessment and surface water drainage strategy will be submitted with the application. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie to let you know what our community benefits are looking like.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Yes, so as well as providing a source of green energy locally and improvements to biodiversity, the solar farm will bring a number of benefits locally. First of all, it'll contribute over £80,000 in business rates to Durham County Council every year, which will be retained by the local authority. There will be some jobs created during the construction of the project and within the supply chain. Typically for a project of this size, you would create about 25 jobs in the supply chain, but there'll be specialist jobs during construction and also the landscaping, which we will most definitely like to invite local people to tender for. There'll be ancillary benefits arising from contractors who will come in from outside the area, stay locally to use local services, and we will be making it public when we are looking for invitations for people to tender for any particular jobs associated with the solar farm during that period. We're also proposing a community benefit fund, which would be £350 per megawatt index linked, so it would rise with inflation every year for the lifetime of the solar farm. The idea of this fund is that it would be spent locally on social and environmental projects. For example, at other solar farms, we've seen energy efficiency measures installed on public buildings, play equipment for children, and at one solar farm in a remote rural area, the Community Benefit Fund was even able to finance fibre optic broadband for the local community. With a solar farm of 49.9 megawatts that we hope to achieve here, this would translate to about £17,000 a year for the next 40 years, or around £700,000 in total. The funds would be administered locally with decisions made on how they should be spent by local people, either through the parish council or by setting up an independent trust. And we very much welcome suggestions from local people on particular projects that might benefit from the community fund. And there is a question in the survey that follows that asks about this. It's also very important to Aura Power to engage the younger generation with the issues around climate change and renewable energy. And as part of this, we have a very exciting programme which we will be setting aside £2,000 of funding for, organising educational sessions with local schools and site visits to the solar farm. We use an existing company to deliver these sessions. They are extremely experienced in what they do and have delivered sessions for thousands of pupils across the country relating to renewable energy projects. They're very well designed and are all linked carefully with the national curriculum. So if you are connected with a local school here, please get in touch with us if you think that they would be interested in participating in this. Now back to
Great.
you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. So timescales then. So consulting with the local community is really important to us and a crucial part of getting our design right to submit a planning application. Following this consultation, we will look to incorporate the views of the local community and interested parties into our proposal and revise our designs if feasible and necessary. We will then finalise our proposed design and aim to submit a planning application in the next couple of months. Durham County Council has already provided pre-application advice, and we will continue to work with the planning officer and specialist consultees once submitted to address any comments raised. After the application is submitted to the council, they will undertake their own consultation process and invite local residents to comment on the application. Our aim is to submit a proposal which not only complies fully with the County Durham's local plan and national planning policy framework, but one which we hope the local community can support. The planning determination period for developments of this scale can take anything from 13 weeks to 32 weeks, but we hope to have a decision towards the end of the year. As Chris mentioned earlier, if approved at the end of this year, we'd look to start construction at the earliest by the spring or summer next year. Okay, so thank you all for listening. We'll now answer any questions that you have. If you haven't already done so, then please do type your question using the Q&A button at the bottom of this screen. I'll then read out that question and one of our panelists will answer. We hope to answer all of your questions during the session, but if we are unable to, then please do contact us. To save time, I'll only read out the ones we haven't addressed already in our presentation. And we have received a couple of questions already on email, and I hope we've addressed those during this consultation. If not, please feel free to get in touch or ask more questions here. Okay, so I will start off. We have a question from George. Thank you, George. So George has said that in the 30 years since Hawthorn plant was closed, nothing has been done to repair the damage to the land. So why is the construction to be built on the only green space between Merton and the wasteland of Hawthorn? So why would you consider it acceptable to cover this land, and why is it being proposed as Hawthorn Pit Solar Farm when none of the old pit is being utilised? That's a very good question, George. Thanks very much. I think Chris is probably quite well posed to answer this question. If you don't mind, I'm happy to chip in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chloe. Okay, so thank you for your question there. So we have an agreement with the landowner that owns the land on under the proposal that we have been explaining today. So it's a different landowner that owns the land where you are talking about, and the owner there wasn't interested in the scheme at the time. So that's part of the reason. But also, just to go back to the importance of securing grid capacity, there are a very finite number of locations within the country, let alone the county, that will accommodate sufficient renewable energy that this particular solar farm would produce on a yearly basis. So it's really important that we do try and use these locations to their full potential. And yeah, and in terms of the point you made in the beginning of the question about the contamination that's happened to the land previously, I mean, that's obviously something that has been there for a long time, and I couldn't comment on that particularly, but yeah, just to restate that for the solar farm, 96% of the panels and the equipment that we'll be putting on the land would be fully recyclable, and so yeah, there'll be no issues with contamination as a result of the solar farm.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we have another question here from an anonymous attendee. Does the proposed development sterilise any further development of neighbouring sites or those sites whereby your infrastructure crosses? For example, is there any remaining grid connection capacity? Chris, this is probably another one for you, if you don't mind.
Yep, sure. Okay, so I think that it's an interesting question. I would suggest that the best person to talk to, or the best entity to talk to, would be the grid. So yeah, Northern Power Grid, I'm sure, would be happy to answer that question.
Okay, great, thank you. So another question here from someone else. So there doesn't appear to be any visuals for the site from the South Hetton side, whilst those shown as current after construction and within 10 years are appreciated. The topography of the area will show significant visibility of the site from this village. E.g., your agreed point view 7, I believe, viewing from West Lane is highly elevated in comparison, as evidenced by the existing Jade development. Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Anybody else, feel free to chip in. So we only had a couple of viewpoints that we prepared specifically for this presentation. This isn't our final design because we want to collate all the feedback from you all, so that will then feed into our final design. We did show a slide which showed the viewpoints that we had agreed with the council, and there are I think 8 in total, and we showed 7 of those. So the others will be submitted with our planning application, and there is one from the South Hetton side and some more around the site as well. Okay, so another question from George. George, I really hope that Chris answered the kind of site viability in his last question. You've just asked again that why we consider this site suitable. So I hope you found our answers to that sufficient. Another question here from Stuart. Thank you, Stuart. Why are you using the A1 motorway and rural roads for access, rather than the A19 and the road to the business park directly from the Merton exit? Rachel or Chris, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah, Rachel, do feel free to chip in if you have additional things to add. So yeah, we're using the roads from the A1M for access and rural roads, rather than from the business park, because that's what the landowner with whom we have the lease agreement with has legal right to. We have tried consulting with the county council, who I think own the land under the business park, to obtain access there as well, because we do appreciate that that would offer an alternative route, and we'd be very keen to pick up those discussions with the county council as a landowner who owns that area as well.
Great, thank you, Chris. So a question here from Gillian. Thanks, Gillian. What species of wildlife mentioned in your list have been identified so far? Rachel, do you want to pick that one up? I'm happy to answer initially, and perhaps if you want to fill in. So we have undertaken a ecology impact assessment, which identifies which animals, which wildlife have been identified. The list of those I can share with those after. I wouldn't want to have a look now because I wouldn't want to mess up the sharing my screen, but we're happy to share those with you, and it will be uploaded with our application documents. However, it's probably important to note that the main focus of identifying any wildlife and the impact assessment report is to include specific measures of mitigation and avoidance so that we are protecting the any wildlife that we have identified to mitigate and avoid any impact on those identified. Okay, so another question here. Inverters and substations are located away from existing residential development, but what about future potential land for development? Will the location sterilise any village expansion and consequently cause future harm to Merton or South Hetton? That's kind of similar question to what we had earlier, but I think, Chris, can you expand on that slightly?
Sure, yeah, I guess that would be a question for the council for those future potential developments. So, yeah, we can't really comment on that particularly. So, yeah, again, that would be a question for the council.
Thanks, Chris. Noise is mentioned as a non-nuisance factor. However, what about glare? Surely this is more relevant. So thank you. That is a very good question. I'll try to answer that initially, but then Rachel, if you or Chris, please feel free to add any additional comments. So glare is, yes, a very important issue or non-issue as we find in many of our solar farms. And that's mainly because our site design has to be designed as to not impact amenity with regards to glare. That's based on national planning policy framework and guidance, but we do undertake a very comprehensive glint and glare assessment, which is underway. We don't have the reports of those yet. However, I think it's important to stress that if there is any impact, then we would be looking to mitigate that impact with screening or panel removal based on those findings.
It's worth also mentioning perhaps that the panels are designed to absorb sunlight, and as panel coatings improve in efficiency, the instances of glint and glare is reducing, and yeah, the whole point of a panel is to absorb as much sunlight as possible. So it wouldn't be working properly if there were if glint and glare were an issue that we're particularly concerned about.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so a question from Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. So is the lifetime of the solar farm 40 years? Yes, it is. And will it be removed after 40 years? So our application for this solar farm is for 40 years, and that's the agreement that we also have with our landowner. At the end of those 40 years, our plan is to decommission the solar farm. As Chris has mentioned a few times, 96% of the infrastructure of the panels can be recycled. The land, because it's left fallow for 40 years, means that the soil has significant time to rest and become more fertile. So hopefully it will be left in an even better state than it is now. Okay, another question from Gillian. As you mentioned that the land lies in Merton Parish, but is much closer to South Hetton and will have the biggest impact during development, how can you ensure South Hetton can access the community fund? That's a really great question, Gillian. Sophie, do you want to answer this?
Yes, absolutely. And we very much are keen that all both parishes that are affected by the solar farm will have access to the funds, and the decisions on how the funds should be used will be made locally, and we'll be talking to both the host parish council and the neighbouring parish council to ensure that the funds are dispersed fairly according to how the degree to which people feel they're affected by the solar farm. So that is absolutely the sort of feedback that is very useful from events like this.
Thanks, Sophie. Another question from Morgan. Is this just a solar farm, or will there also be batteries for energy storage? So Chris, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So it is just a solar farm. There won't be any batteries that will be part of this application. We don't have any import capacity in our connection offer that we've secured. So yeah, this will just be for a solar farm.
Thank you, Chris. Question from Paul. What do you class as peak times? So I presume that is in reference to our construction. And we've said before that we will be completing a full traffic management plan, which will identify when those peak times are. The surveys are being undertaken, so the report will identify what we have identified to be those peak times, but generally they're during your standard kind of rush hour school run to work, morning and evening time. So we'd look to avoid those to not add any additional pressure on the transport network at those times.
Can I just add to that? We'd usually agree that as a condition with the transport department of the council as one of the planning conditions.
That's great, thank you, Rachel. Great, so a question from John. You mentioned there's one landowner. Are you able to say who that landowner is? I'm not sure we can at this point. We haven't asked permission from the landowner to publicly announce who that is. We can have a chat with him or her at one point and share those details if they're happy for us to do so. John, you've asked another question. Have we agreed a price? Yes, we have. Chris, if you want to expand on that, you're most welcome. Obviously, we can't give any commercial sensitive information away. But yeah, Chris, do you want to chip in?
No, I think you've done a great job there, Chloe. That's probably about as much we can say.
Cool. The question from Paul. So consultation, only 950 dwellings. Why did not all the residents in Merton get a leaflet? That's a very good question, Paul. So we have identified that obviously it's quite a densely populated area. We have targeted the nearest residents. We have also not only done a leaflet drop, but we've also advertised our public consultation in the local paper. We've publicised it, we've sent information in through to the parish councils, which we hope managed to share that information as well. We had some press releases which also appeared in the local paper. So I think through all of our platforms of advertisement for the public consultation, we hope we reached quite a significant amount more residents than just the 950 that received our leaflets.
And I'd just add to that, Chloe, that also the news about the consultation was shared on the local Facebook page as well, which is obviously another good way of making sure that everybody gets to know about it.
Yeah, exactly. Social media is great for those kind of things. So yeah. Thank you. So question from Morgan. Will any of the new cables need to cross underneath the footpaths? I'm not sure about that one. So Chris or Rachel, would you have those details at all, or is it something we won't know until later?
Yeah, so I think some of them certainly will do, but they'd be buried relatively deep underneath the footpath, and so there wouldn't be a safety risk. And during any works to footpaths, the footpaths would be temporarily diverted, so there's no safety issues.
Thanks, Chris. Another question from John. Thank you, John. Is this plan A part of a bigger plan for the future? Chris, can you answer that?
So no, it's not. As I sort of alluded to in response to the first question, the development, the proposal is based entirely on the availability of grid capacity which we've secured, and with the proposal that we have outlined, that maximises that capacity, and we don't have any more. So if there are no plans from us, I mean, I can't speak for other developers, and I can't speak for other connections that other outfits may have, but certainly for us, we've maximised our connection, and yeah, there's no second phase, if you like.
Thanks, Chris. Another question here. So the views of the farm from the north cannot be masked, as you said. We in our homes are looking down across the valley and virtually on top of the panels. Okay, that's really interesting to know. I mean, we'd be happy to pick up discussions with you offline. So please do feel free to get in touch with me directly. We appreciate, that this solar farm does have a change to the landscape, but we have this public consultation so that we can look to further mitigate any impact. One thing that we do look to encourage in our community benefit fund is the application for grants, which would be available to for residents to put some additional tree planting actually in their on their property, so if that's even at the bottom of the garden or whatever. But yeah, the purpose of this consultation is to understand these concerns and see what else we can do to further reduce the impact. Another question, so when will you be able to show us exactly what will be visible from each angle indicated in the earlier screen? How long will this take? This is the most important thing to residents. Yep, that is a very good question. So our landscape architect is working on a number of documents, including the photo montages. As we've mentioned before, our site layout could potentially change slightly following this, so it'd be premature to produce all of those photo montages, which is what they're called, the computer generated images at this point, but they will be submitted with our planning application, and they will be publicly available to you then. Okay, so a question from Kevin. Regarding the glint and glare survey, can you predict at this stage using past experience if there will be any refraction on the residential properties at Merton and South Hetton? So I think I answered that question earlier, Kevin, just with regards to, even if there was any, I think they call it geometric, if there's any hypothetical glint and glare from the solar farms, we have to include mitigation that would prevent that from happening in the first place. Rachel, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. In general, if there is going to be glint and glare from a solar farm, it would be to properties directly to the east or west of the site. Because glint and glare would only happen when the sun is low in the sky and then the sun is reflecting off the solar panels, which would be first thing in the morning or last thing at night, and that wouldn't be in the direction of either of the two towns or villages.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much, Rachel. So my home looks right onto the fields. Which way will the panels be facing? Away from the houses or towards them? If facing towards, there'll be glare. So yeah, I think Rachel's just answered that exactly for you. If there was any impact, it would be to the west and east.
And just to also add, the panels face directly south, if that answers part of the question as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so a question from Paul. Is there any other solar sites in the country of this size, close to dwellings as proposed? So Paul, Chris, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. I'm sure that there are lots of solar farms that are near to residential properties. So yes, I suppose the answer is yes, there are solar farms of this size that are nearby residential properties. I know Sophie lives near one, so perhaps she can answer this in a bit more detail.
Yes, I live very near a solar farm that's actually a bit smaller than this, but there are quite a large number of solar farms of this size being developed all across the country, and I know of several examples of other solar farms which are as close to houses or even closer than the houses at this one.
Thank you, Sophie. What is the distance of the closest inverter to dwellings? Chris, I don't think we know that off the top of our head, to be honest, John. It's probably something that we can have a look back on our CAD drawing and make those calculations. So yeah, we can have a look. If you're concerned with regards to noise, I think we can comfortably say that we don't envisage any impact at the nearest residential dwellings. Yeah. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. How certain are you that the houses overlooking the farm won't be adversely affected by glare? And why pick the only greenfield site when there is so much brownfield capacity? So I think we have mostly answered this question. I don't know if there's any more we can really add to this, unless any of our panelists want to add any further comments at this stage.
Well, we could comment on why we're not using brownfield land.
Yeah, that's a good topic. Probably one, yeah, if you want to pick that up, please do.
It's very difficult to find brownfield sites that are suitable for solar farms, particularly given the need to be near a grid connection, and they tend to have higher value for development for housing or other commercial developments. We would always want to develop a solar farm on brownfield land if it was available, but it is very often not available with the right other features that we need to be able to build a solar farm, and it's often priced out because it's higher value for housing.
I'd just add to that as well, the nature of installing a solar farm when you're piling doesn't suit a lot of brownfield sites, because you don't want anything to go into the ground, especially in an area like this where there's coal mining history of the site. It's not really good for this type of development.
Thank you both. So another question with regards to the location of the inverters and substation. Are they located on the South Hetton side or the Merton side, towards the eastern boundary, which is commercial land for further development of Jade Park? So we'll upload these slides, so you'll be able to have a closer look after, which does show the location of the substation, and it's kind of it's on the south side, in the middle, basically in front of the substation. So it's not directly next to any dwellings. That we've purposely located it there. And similarly with the inverters, they are located away from residential dwellings to avoid any impact from noise. Kevin, question here. Thanks, Kevin. So the residents and parish council will definitely require a comprehensive copy of your environmental studies to access the impact on the environmental and wildlife. Yeah, we completely agree, and those documents will be publicly available once we submit our application. So we right up until the point of our application, we're working away on them, so we can't share them beforehand because they might change, but they'll certainly be available to you to have a good look through, and we'll notify you when we upload those. Okay, so just a couple more questions left. The northeast coast is not noted for its sunshine record. Is this actually the right location for the solar farm? Information from other locations indicate they are not very efficient. It's a very good question. Chris, you might be best placed to answer this.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Yeah, so certainly there is a decreasing trajectory of irradiation as you go from the southwest of the UK up to the tip of northern Scotland. But actually the yield here, and by yield I mean the sort of irradiation yield, how much energy do you get from the sun, it is actually surprisingly good. And that's because it's near to the sea, and there's some complex physics that goes on in locations near to the sea in terms of irradiation, and there's a marked improvement, 10% improvement you get from being located nearby coastal areas. And so actually the yield here is pretty good. It's with single digit figures less good than other parts of the best performing parts of the UK, but it's certainly good enough to produce a huge volume of energy and help decarbonise the economy.
Great, thank you, Chris. So a couple more questions left. So no hedges next to footpaths, but will there be new fences next to footpaths, and how tall will these fences be? So we touched upon that earlier in our presentation. So the site does have to be lined with a 2-metre fence, and that's for security purposes and for safety purposes, and they'll be round the whole perimeter, including the edges of footpaths, so that there's no public access into the solar farm itself.
Yeah, and sorry, Claire, I'll just pick up on the point about the hedges. If the community feels that they would like us to make amendments to the proposal of our hedging proposals, then please do let us know. That's the purpose of this very webinar. We want to learn how we can try and improve the proposal to everyone's benefit. So if that's something that you would like us to consider doing, then you know that's great, and we'll go away and reflect on that.
Thanks, Chris. So we've got one final question here. Oh, and another one that's just popped up. Will the national grid converters be north or south of the site? So I believe they have their consultation up and running on their website. I can't recall whether they've detailed exactly where it's positioned. I think they have. I think, and I'm certain they're towards the south of our site. Okay, so a question from Paul. As there are a number of footpaths running through the site, what are the risks of being exposed to electromagnetic fields? Sophie or Chris, do you want to take that?
Shall I go first, Chris, and you can add to it? There's no risk of being exposed to an electromagnetic field from a solar farm. People have lived with solar panels on the roofs of their houses for decades now without any ill effects. And as I may have mentioned earlier in the presentation, I live next to a solar farm, and I walk my dog next to the solar farm, 3-4 times a week, and have been doing so for the last 7-8 years. It was one of the earlier solar farms built in the country, and we're showing no ill effects from it.
Thanks, Sophie. Final question, I think, unless we've got any others coming in. One from Stephen. Thanks, Stephen. Would you do school trips and outline how the site works? So Sophie mentioned earlier that our community benefit fund includes an allocation of £2,000 a year out of that £17,500, and that will be allocated specifically for local schools to come to the site, and we do work with a specialised company called Solar Power Education, who put on those site visits and also workshops to educate those local school children. One other question, how many panels? That's a very good question, Helen. We probably can't answer that right now because, like we said, this is an indicative design, and the number of panels may change based on these conversations and discussions, but you will be able to see the full design once we upload that to our during the planning application process. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions answered. Thank you so much for all of your time and all of your questions as well. We'd be really grateful if you could complete our short survey, which you'll receive probably tomorrow. And if you have anything else you would like to discuss further with us, then please do get in touch using the contact details you can see on the screen here. They're also on our website, and you'll also get an email tomorrow as well. I'll also be in the area at the end of the week, so if you would like to meet with me and discuss in person, then please do let me know. I'd be happy to come and meet with you. If you are watching the recorded version of this, you can find the feedback questionnaire on our webpage. Your personal details will not be passed on to any third parties and will only be used for the purpose of this public consultation. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks a lot.